Okay, guys, we're going to look at slavery in the colonies, which we've watched some videos on, and you should have some notes on your ABC chart that you've taken about the different types of slavery in the colonies that we've seen, like indentured servants or slaves. There were passages or routes that were taken to get here from Africa. And so we're going to really focus in on these three different types of passages. You'll need to take these notes down as we're going over it, so that way you'll have them for when it's time to take a test. So the first one we're going to talk about is actually what it encompassed total as the Atlantic slave trade. This was moving the African slaves either into the Caribbean islands or into America. So during this time, about 10 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. This was between 1500 and 1800, which you'll see right here on the notes. They were taken from the African coast. Now, if you remember, we talked about and we saw in the video that a lot of these people were actually enslaved by other Africans. So slave traders would set up their posts on the West African coast, and other Africans would go in and raid tribes, and they would raid those tribes to bring them into these West African coast posts, and from there the Europeans would purchase or trade for the African slaves. Now, the actual part of them moving across the coast, the Atlantic, was called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was where they went across the Atlantic and they became slaves in America. Now, the reason why the Middle Passage is so important, if you remember, we saw that picture in the video of the slaves on the boat. Well, that was during the Middle Passage. Now, these captives that were taken during the Atlantic slave trade, they were traded for guns and other goods, and the Middle Passage became the brutal voyage that they took from Africa either to the Caribbeans or to the Americas. This increased profits for a lot of your British colonies. We're going to talk about a man in class on Monday called Olaudah Equiano, and we're going to actually hear his story about doing his traveling across the Middle Passage. During the Middle Passage, though, we see that 15 to 20% of enslaved Africans ended up being killed. They died themselves, like on the voyage, or they committed suicide. And once they got into the Americas or the Caribbean, they were sold either as one single person or they were sold as a group of people, and that was also on that video that we saw talking about Sullivan's Island and bringing them into Charleston. Now, the last part that you need to look at or know about is the triangular trade route. This is actually the whole Atlantic slave trade combined into one. It was a three-way trade between the colonies and the islands of the Caribbean and Africa. So what would happen is there were three parts to the actual triangle trade. The first leg of the voyage, ships from New England would carry fish, lumber, and other goods to the Caribbean islands or into the West Indies. There, British people, traders, would buy sugar and molasses, which is a syrup, we should know that, made from sugar cane, and they would sell their ships back to New England. So they would go down to the Caribbean islands from the New England colonies and then sell back up to the New England colonies, okay? And then when they got back there, they would use the molasses and the sugar to make rum. Now, the second part of this whole journey in the triangle trade is that they would take the rum, guns, and other goods from New England to West Africa. So they would sell from New England down to West Africa. And once they got there, they would trade those goods for enslaved Africans. And then on the last part of their journey, they would carry the slaves, or the enslaved Africans, back to the West Indies. And when they would arrive in the West Indies, they would sell them. And then the process would start all over again. There they would get molasses or sugarcane, take that back up to New England. New England would make rum. They would go back down to Africa and start all over. This is how a lot of your New England merchants became so wealthy, was because of the triangular trade. There was an act that was in place called the Navigation Act, which we'll talk a lot more about later on. But the Navigation Act was set up by the English monarchy to pay basically taxes to the English. It was an agreement that all the English colonies would only buy from other English colonies. But with this showed that this was not happening. All right, we're going to hit this a whole bunch more when we get into class on Monday and Tuesday. And so you need to understand it, because you're going to actually have to map make. And I hope that you will take the little quiz, because it is a daily grade, so you need to do that. Talk to you later, Miss Knight.